One weekday morning in 2005, Gabriela Ortiz Herrera stood in her small kitchen in Boston, Massachusetts, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs. She stepped away from the stove to grab a stack of plates from her cabinet, and then she set them on the table just as her oven started to beep. She turned off the oven and pulled out a tray of biscuits. After setting the biscuits down to cool, she paused to take a deep breath and sip her coffee. For Gabriela, the last few days had been really hectic. Some of her relatives were visiting from the Bronx and New York City, and while Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, loved having her 4 cousins and her grandmother around, hosting the extended family was a big job, especially in their very modest apartment. Gabriela stirred the eggs until they finished cooking. Then she turned off the stove, set all the food on the table, and called to her family that breakfast was served. Gabriela's nieces and nephews came barreling down the stairs, followed closely by their grandmother, Maria, who was so young and energetic that she could keep up with the kids. And then a long moment later, Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, came down after them. Gabriela watched her daughter walk down the stairs very slowly and gingerly, keeping one of her small hands on the railing as if she were trying to steady herself. The little girl made it to the bottom of the stairs and slowly walked into the living room, but then she accidentally bumped into the coffee table and started looking around as if she didn't even understand that she had walked into the table. Gabriela asked her daughter if she was okay, and Camilla looked up at her mom with tears in her eyes, and she told her mom that actually her head hurt so much that she wasn't hungry. And then suddenly Camilla was sobbing, saying that she wished her head didn't hurt all the time. While her relatives filled their plates, Gabriela squatted down next to her daughter and wiped the tears away from her cheeks. For the last few months, Camilla had been complaining that she had a headache almost every single day. At first, the pain did not seem that bad, so Gabriela figured her daughter was just tired or maybe dehydrated from playing so hard, and so Gabriela had just given her daughter water and over-the-counter medicine, and Camilla did seem to get better. But in the last few days, Camilla's headaches had gotten so bad that they were making her cry like this, and now she wouldn't even eat because of her headache. Gabriela turned around to her extended family and explained what was going on with her daughter. She said she had to take Camilla to the hospital to get her headaches checked out. Camilla's grandmother insisted on going with them, and that meant that all the cousins would be coming too. So all the family pushed their food aside, and they all packed into Gabriela's car and headed towards Boston Children's Hospital. About half an hour later, Gabriela helped her little daughter onto a bed inside of the pediatric emergency room. The walls of the room they were in were painted with all these colorful images from popular children's books, but the cheerful decor did not seem to make Camilla feel any less miserable. The only thing that helped her was the fact that her dad, Joel, had shown up at the hospital too. Gabriela had called him at work, and he had left early to come be with the family. Little Camilla sat with her father, Joel, on the hospital bed and leaned her head on his shoulder, while a nurse brought in extra chairs for the large family. Gabriela had already told the nurse about Camilla's headache symptoms, and now they were waiting for an ER doctor to come examine her. A few minutes later, a tall, thin man in a white coat entered the room and shook hands with Camilla's entire family. He introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Patton and then turned to Gabriela and asked her to tell him about her daughter. Gabriela said that normally Camilla was the super high-energy kid. She wasn't in school yet, but she was very bright, and Gabriela and Joel read her books almost every night before bed. Camilla was also very close with her entire extended family. She actually stayed with her grandmother Maria in the Bronx in New York every other month, and then stayed with her parents the rest of the time. Maria was still in her 40s, and she was virtually co-parenting Camilla as well as her cousins in New York, which was a tall order. All the kids were young and totally rambunctious, except for little Camilla, ever since she developed these headaches. Gabriela explained that Camilla's pain seemed minor at first, but it had gotten worse over time. Camilla said it felt like somebody was squeezing her head really hard, and that where it hurt most was behind her forehead and eyes. Gabriela said that it appeared like the pain seemed to fade whenever Camilla was busy, but it never really went away. Dr. Patton nodded and asked Gabriela if her daughter had any other symptoms that concerned her. Gabriela said that actually yes, recently, in addition to these headaches, her daughter had seemed clumsier than normal. She would bump into things as if she wasn't seeing them, and once when she was eating, it was like she couldn't figure out how to use her fork during dinner, which totally didn't make sense. But Gabriela admitted that, perhaps her daughter was kind of teasing her with the silverware thing, but she really couldn't be sure. Dr. Patton made a note of this. Then he asked if little Camilla took any regular medications, and her mother said no. Sometimes she gave her daughter over-the-counter pain medicine, but that was it. Dr. Patton nodded. He said headaches were common and usually went away on their own. But the fact that Camilla's pain had lasted so long and become so severe was concerning. Plus, her clumsiness could be a sign of a neurological problem. Gabriella's stomach twisted with anxiety, and she started worrying that she had waited too long to bring Camilla to a doctor. She knew she must have looked terrified because Dr. Patton quickly assured her that little Camilla was almost certainly fine. They just needed to perform a quick physical examination to make sure. Camilla's father, Joel, helped Camilla sit upright while the doctor checked her vital signs. He tested her pulse, blood pressure, and temperature, and felt along her scalp and temples for sore spots. After that, he shined a small light into her eyes to make sure her pupils dilated correctly, and then Dr. Patton stepped back and told the parents that their daughter seemed normal. But Camilla was obviously in a lot of pain, and so the doctor said he didn't want to send her home quite yet without making absolutely sure she was okay. So the doctor offered to call in the hospital's neurology fellow, who had just finished his medical training, for a second opinion. Gabriella eagerly nodded. She still felt nervous, but she was thankful that Dr. Patton was doing everything he could to help their daughter. About 30 minutes later, a well-known pediatric neurologist named Dr. David Urian entered Camilla's hospital room. Dr. Urian was an old, kindly man with gray hair, glasses, and a bow tie, and he had been at his office at nearby Harvard Medical School when the neurology fellow had called him and said they had this puzzling case at Children's Hospital. There was a 5-year-old girl suffering from chronic headaches, clumsiness, and confusion, but her physical and neurological exams both looked normal. The fellow had asked Dr. Urian to come over and see if he could figure out what was going on with her. And so now, Dr. Urian saw Camilla's mother, father, and extended family standing around Camilla's bed, watching her anxiously. Dr. Urian introduced himself and said hello, and Camilla's relatives nodded and waved, but the little girl herself didn't even acknowledge him. She just stared down at her feet, looking scared and uncomfortable. The neurology fellow, who was very clean-cut and looked to be about 30 years old, handed Dr. Urian a copy of Camilla's medical charts and briefed the older doctor on what they knew so far. Dr. Urian said he wanted to start by doing another neurological exam. The fellow stayed in the room to observe while Dr. Urian went to Camilla's bedside. Now that he was standing over her, Camilla looked up at him and blinked several times. The doctor asked her for her name and birthday, and she answered both questions correctly. Next, Dr. Urian asked Camilla to push with her arms and legs against his hands, and when she did, she seemed strong. Then he asked her to walk around the room, and she didn't have any problems balancing. When she sat back down, he told her to close her eyes. Then, he touched a tuning fork to her arms and legs and asked her to tell him where she felt the cold metal. Again, Camilla answered correctly. Finally, Dr. Urian shined a small flashlight into the girl's eyes, and her pupils dilated normally, just like Dr. Patton had seen earlier. However, the neurologist wasn't actually looking at Camilla's pupils. He was looking behind them, into the very back of her eye, at an area called the retina. Dr. Urian carefully examined the tiny blood vessels in Camilla's retinas. Normally, the blood vessels deep inside of a person's eyes pulsate at the same rate as their heartbeat, but Camilla's were not pulsating at all. Dr. Urian had only seen this a few times before, but he knew retinal veins stop pulsating when a patient has an unusually high amount of pressure inside of their skull, often from some kind of an injury. To him, this was an obvious sign that Camilla was not suffering from typical headaches. More likely, she was in agony because she had suffered a serious head injury at some point and had brain swelling or bleeding, or possibly she could even have a brain tumor. Dr. Urian didn't want to alarm Camilla's family, so he quietly excused himself and asked the neurology fellow to join him in the hall. And once they were out there, Dr. Urian quietly explained what he had seen inside of the girl's eyes. Then Dr. Urian went back into the room and told Camilla's family that he wanted to get a better idea of what was happening in Camilla's head by performing what's called a CT scan, which is a type of X-ray that creates detailed pictures of a patient's internal organs. Camilla's mother, Gabriella, looked very nervous and overwhelmed, but she said okay, and so Dr. Urian called the radiology department to order the scan. Less than half an hour later, Camilla's CT scan was finished, and Dr. Urian strode down a hallway, test results in hand. He had reviewed the black and white images of Camilla's brain, and he didn't see any evidence of swelling, bleeding, or a tumor, which was a good sign. But he didn't know how to square these results with what he saw inside of the girl's eyes. Dr. Urian feared that Camilla had a neurological problem that didn't show up on the CT scan. He knew CT scans didn't capture literally everything, and it was possible Camilla had some kind of hidden tumor or abnormality that was causing these symptoms. But Dr. Urian also knew that brain tumors in 5-year-olds were incredibly rare, and so there was no reason to make Camilla's family panic until he had a more definitive diagnosis. So he planned to choose his words very carefully. Then he turned a corner in the hallway and opened the door to Camilla's room to speak with her family. When Gabriella heard the door open, she was sitting on the bed with Camilla's head in her lap. She watched her daughter blink at the sound of the door opening. Then Gabriella looked up at Dr. Urian and forced herself to smile, hoping her daughter would not see how truly afraid she actually was. Dr. Urian told Camilla's family that her CT scan results appeared normal. And right away, Gabriella immediately felt relief wash over her. Her forced smile suddenly became genuine. But Joel was not smiling, and neither was Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Maria asked the doctor what this meant for her granddaughter. If Camilla's CT scan was normal, then why did she keep getting these headaches? Like, what was going on here? Dr. Urian admitted that he was still trying to figure that out. He said he wanted to do another type of scan called an MRI with contrast. This was a much more advanced imaging technique than the CT scan, and it required doctors to inject Camilla with a special dye to make the image of her brain sharper and easier to read. The procedure could also be tricky for kids. Camilla would have to lie very still inside of a long tube-shaped machine that made a lot of loud noises. When she heard this, Gabriella suddenly was scared again. She felt like there might be something the neurologist wasn't telling her. Otherwise, why would he keep making her daughter undergo more tests? But Gabriella did not argue. She just said okay, and she watched the doctor leave the room. Then Gabriella looked down at her daughter's head in her lap, looking so small and so vulnerable. She gently brushed Camilla's long dark hair behind her ear and wondered what doctors could be looking for inside of her head. About an hour later, Dr. Urian and a whole medical team huddled around a computer screen in the radiology department to examine the results of Camilla's MRI with contrast. One doctor used a mouse to adjust the brightness and contrast of the image, and as the picture became clearer, Dr. Urian noticed something odd. Camilla's optic nerves, which connected her eyes to her brain, looked strangely bright, almost like they were painted to glow in the dark. Dr. Urian had never seen anything like this before, and he asked his team if any of them knew what this meant, and all of them shook their heads no. This was totally weird to them too. Unsure what else to do, the neurologist called the hospital's eye doctor, who told Dr. Urian to send Camilla right over for an exam. Just a few minutes after Camilla's eye exam, Dr. Urian, who was still in the radiology department looking over Camilla's MRI results, got a call back from the hospital's eye doctor. And he said something truly shocking. Camilla was almost totally blind. She had practically no vision at all in her right eye, and her left eye wasn't much better. Dr. Urian was speechless. Camilla had never said a word to her mother, her father, or grandmother about not being able to see. But the eye doctor told him that was actually pretty normal. Children Camilla's age often don't voice concerns about their vision because the way they see the world is kind of what's normal to them. They don't really know how they're supposed to see things yet. Dr. Urian thanked the doctor and hung up. He looked back at Camilla's MRI results, which now made a little more sense. Her optic nerves had somehow gotten damaged, and that's why they looked so strange on the MRI. Camilla was not gradually becoming clumsy and confused because of a brain tumor. The child literally couldn't see. But all of this didn't explain why Camilla had lost her vision or how they could preserve the eyesight she still had. Clearly, pressure had to be building up in Camilla's skull, Dr. Urian thought, but from what? If it wasn't due to bleeding, swelling, or a tumor, maybe it was from an infection. And so now, Dr. Urian wanted to do one more test, and he already knew Camilla and her whole family were not going to like it. Later that afternoon, Gabriella sat next to Joel and Camilla on the hospital bed. They'd been in the ER for hours. Camilla's cousins were all bored and tired, and Maria just flipped kind of mindlessly through TV channels, hoping to find something to keep the kids entertained. Meanwhile, Camilla's headaches were relentless. After her eye exam, she'd come back into the room and laid down with her eyes shut, and she'd barely moved since. Just then, Gabriella heard a knock at the door, and Dr. Urian came inside. He said he had some surprising news. The results from Camilla's eye exam showed that she was almost completely blind. Gabriella just stared at the doctor in shock. She thought back to the evening when Camilla couldn't figure out how to use her fork, and she realized her daughter wasn't playing games. She really could not see the food on her plate. All those times Camilla had seemed confused or bumped into things, it was because the whole world looked blurry to her. Gabriella couldn't believe she'd missed something that now seemed so obvious. She looked over at Joel, who seemed just as dumbfounded. But before Gabriella or Joel or Maria could ask any questions, Dr. Urian said he wanted to perform yet another test to figure out what was causing the girl's blindness. He said Camilla needed to undergo something called a spinal tap, which is a procedure where doctors insert a needle into the patient's spine and remove the sample of cerebrospinal fluid. Analyzing this fluid can help doctors diagnose brain infections. But at this point, Gabriella was starting to feel like her daughter was turning into a human pincushion. Camilla had already had a physical exam, 2 neurological exams, an eye exam, a CT scan, and an MRI with contrast. Now, Dr. Urian wanted to jab a needle into her daughter's spine? Gabriella wondered if this was too much for her daughter. But Dr. Urian promised the procedure might be scary sounding, but it was safe. Plus, it was necessary, because he still hadn't determined the cause of Camilla's terrible headaches, let alone her vision loss. Gabriella took a deep breath and said, "Okay, fine," as Joel wrapped an arm around her shoulders for support. A few minutes later, a different doctor came into the room to perform the spinal tap. He instructed Camilla to lie sideways on the bed and curl up into a ball. Gabriella held her daughter's hand tightly as the doctor cleaned Camilla's lower back and gave her a numbing shot. Then the doctor inserted a long, thin needle into Camilla's spine. The needle was attached to a syringe, and as the doctor pulled the stopper backwards, the syringe slowly filled with clear fluid. The doctor removed the needle, placed a bandage on Camilla's back, and said they would send her spinal fluid to the lab for analysis right away. Then the doctor left the room, and Gabriella loosened her grip on her daughter's hand. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Urian was in his office when he received the results of Camilla's spinal tap. There was no unusual bacteria in her spinal fluid, which ruled out the possibility of a brain infection. But the results also showed that the pressure inside of her head and spinal column was dangerously high, 2.5 times the normal level. This confirmed what Dr. Urian had already concluded, but he still didn't know where the pressure was coming from. All he knew was that there was no evidence of the usual causes of brain swelling. And yet the pressure inside of Camilla's head was so high that it had damaged her optic nerves and caused her to lose her vision. And as Dr. Urian thought this over, he suddenly remembered that there was actually a name for this condition. It was called a pseudotumor cerebri. This meant Camilla had many of the symptoms associated with a brain tumor, but didn't actually have a tumor. This condition was so rare, especially in children, that Dr. Urian had not even considered it until just now. Dr. Urian rushed back to Camilla's hospital room and told her family about her diagnosis. He said pseudotumors can be caused by a variety of things, and he needed their help to figure out what caused this one in Camilla. The neurologist asked the family again if she took any medications or if there was any way she could have taken somebody else's medication by accident. Camilla's mother, father, and grandmother all said no, there was no way. Dr. Urian didn't want to offend Camilla's guardians by continuing to press them, so he printed out a list of all the possible causes of Camilla's condition and gave it to her family. Her mother, father, and grandmother quickly began to look over this list, and before long, the doctor noticed Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Her expression completely changed. Her eyes widened as she stared at the sheet, and then she looked up at him in a total panic. Maria said she might know what made Camilla sick, but she would have to go all the way home to the Bronx to get it. While Maria traveled to and from New York, Joel took his nieces and nephews back to his and Gabriella's small apartment, and Gabriella stayed with their daughter at the hospital. Dr. Urian kept an eye on Camilla and worked to try to reduce the pressure inside of her head by draining more fluid from her spine and giving her special medications. and little by little, Camilla did start feeling better. The next day, Maria returned from the Bronx, and she sheepishly handed Dr. Urian a small bottle. She said her granddaughter's illness was definitely all her fault. Then the doctor read the label on the bottle she handed him, and all of Camilla's symptoms suddenly made sense. The bottle that Maria gave the doctor contained fish oil supplements, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as well as vitamins A and D. Maria took these supplements religiously. She believed they strengthened her heart and also reduced her pain from arthritis. And when Camilla stayed with her grandmother in the Bronx every other month, Maria gave her 1 pill a day too. But when Dr. Urian looked at the bottle, he realized these fish oil pills were not formulated for kids. They were made for adults. So every time Camilla took one, she was getting 3 times the recommended dose of vitamin A for a child her age. That much vitamin A can wreak havoc on a young person's body and lead to irreversible organ damage. And in this case, it caused pressure to build up inside of Camilla's head, which then caused her to lose her vision and develop constant, debilitating headaches. Obviously, from this point forward, nobody in this family gave Camilla any more fish oil, which halted any further damage to Camilla's eyesight and nervous system. And while Camilla did luckily regain some of her vision, her eyesight was, unfortunately, permanently altered. She's now able to live a relatively normal life with the help of glasses and contact lenses, but she still does get the occasional headache. Veronica Boza looked out the window of the music studio and then down at her iPhone. As she tapped the icon that would show her the weather forecast, the 39-year-old Nashville, Tennessee music producer hoped that tomorrow would be as clear and warm as today had been. Nashville's weather was usually predictable, but it was August of 2010, and just 3 months before, the city had been slammed by the worst flood in its history. Ever since then, Veronica had stopped taking for granted that every summer day would be hot and humid, and like so many other Nashville residents, she checked the weather report regularly now in case there were any other extreme weather events in the forecast. At the reassuring sight of a tiny yellow sun displayed on her smartphone screen, along with a predicted high for the following day of 92 degrees Fahrenheit, Veronica smiled. She and her 9-year-old son, Jordan, had already decided that if Saturday's weather was sunny and hot, they were going to spend all day at the community pool in their new neighborhood. After putting her phone away, Veronica gathered her things and began getting ready to leave the studio and head for home where Jordan was waiting for her. But on Veronica's way out the door, one of her coworkers reached out and put a hand on Veronica's arm. As Veronica stopped and looked questioningly at her friend, the woman asked quietly, "Hey, Veronica, is everything okay?" Veronica smiled, her warm brown eyes almost as dark as her hair. She loved her job here in the city known as the music capital of the world, and she also loved the fact that she worked with such a tight-knit community of people who genuinely cared about each other's lives. It had not exactly been a secret that Veronica was going through a tough divorce and that Jordan, who sometimes accompanied his mother to work, had become a bit withdrawn and clingy as his parents worked out their personal and legal differences. But when it came to her divorce, at least at work, Veronica tried not to dwell on the pain and personal difficulties she'd been experiencing. But even though she wasn't necessarily sharing these feelings at work, the fact was that Veronica was feeling some anxiety. She and her husband Tim had been married for 15 years. They had met and fallen in love shortly after Veronica had immigrated to the US from Italy in 1994. They had both been in their mid-20s when they met, and they both had big dreams. Tim was a construction worker who had plans to build a home remodeling business. As for Veronica, she wanted to work in the entertainment industry. And for the first dozen years of their marriage, their life together in north central Tennessee had been good. Tim did build up his business, and while Veronica worked some part-time jobs, she also went back to school and earned a degree in communications. And 7 years after getting married, Tim and Veronica had their only child, their son Jordan, who was the apple of his mother's eye. It had taken Veronica's career a little longer than Tim's to take off, but when it did, and she got a job as a music producer in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Bozes lived, it seemed like the sky was the limit for her. Veronica, who was not only beautiful with her dark hair and features and olive skin, also had that it factor that just made people like her and want to be around her. She was also a devout Catholic who hardly ever missed a Sunday service at her local church. But despite having this celebrity-like style and charisma, Veronica was very modest and never tried to put herself in the spotlight. And in her career, this was literally the case. Her job was to work behind the scenes with recording artists to help them make new music. And in 2009, Veronica was so in demand as a producer that she was asked to produce that year's Country Music Television Awards, which was a very big challenge. But Veronica did a great job, which really elevated her amongst her peers. But as Veronica's star was on the rise, Tim's career was starting to falter. And then, starting in 2007, the construction industry was rocked by the Great Recession. That's when the US housing market went from boom to bust, and large amounts of mortgage-backed investments suddenly lost value. And so around that time, Tim's construction and home remodeling business took a serious hit, putting a strain on the family. In addition to stress over their new financial problems, Veronica's job was becoming so demanding that she was working 10 to 14 hours every day. This while Tim suddenly found himself scrambling for any customers. By 2009, the pressure on the Bozas was just too much, and their marriage collapsed, and the couple filed for divorce. When they split, Veronica moved to an upscale neighborhood 30 minutes outside of Nashville, while Tim had to move back in with his mother. And even though both Tim and Veronica were in agreement on some things, they both loved Jordan, and they both were ready to move on with new romantic relationships, the couple had reached an impasse while trying to negotiate a final settlement on child support and a custody arrangement. But finally, it seemed like those last two issues would be resolved, and that by September or early October of that year, the divorce would be final. So, when Veronica looked into her worried coworker's face that Friday afternoon as she was leaving work, Veronica just smiled at her friend and told her how much she appreciated her support, and she assured her that the whole divorce was going to be over soon and that everything would be okay. Her friend smiled back, relieved, and asked Veronica if she had any interesting weekend plans. And Veronica's face lit up as she told her friend that tomorrow, she and her son were going to head to the pool for the day. A few minutes later, Veronica was settled into the driver's seat of her dark blue SUV. She reached into her purse, slipped on her sunglasses, and headed west, away from the noise and honky-tonk glamour of the city to Hermitage, a Nashville suburb named for its main landmark, the plantation where Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, had lived for more than 40 years. Her destination was a quiet, affluent neighborhood just 7 miles south of the famous plantation, a development called Bridgewater, where Veronica and Jordan lived in a 3-story pale brick colonial-style home with black shutters and a covered front porch supported by 6 white columns. Her 2-car garage was located in the back of the house, and she reached the garage by turning down a narrow dead-end street that ran parallel to the street in front of her house. As Veronica turned down that little dead-end road, she felt the same thrill she'd felt 4 months earlier when she'd bought the house. It was perfect for her and Jordan. Her neighbors were friendly but not intrusive, the wooden fence around her backyard gave her and Jordan plenty of privacy, and the whole place just felt very safe and secure. Veronica turned right into her driveway, and after parking her car in the garage, she headed inside to see her son Jordan. The next day, Saturday, went exactly to plan. Veronica and Jordan drove to the nearby community recreation center where the pools sparkled in the sunshine. As Veronica read and sunbathed, Jordan and the other kids splashed and played in the cool water. By the time they got home that afternoon, Jordan was tired and happy, and Veronica was tanned and rested. The next morning, Sunday, August 29th, Veronica bustled around the kitchen making breakfast for both of them. When they were finished eating, Veronica reminded her son to pack his overnight bag with anything special that he wanted to take to his dad's house. The plan that morning was that Veronica and Jordan would go to church, and then afterward, they would meet Jordan's father, Tim, in the parking lot, and he would take Jordan for the next couple of days. By 10 a.m., Veronica and Jordan were climbing into Veronica's car, and a minute later, they were on the road for the 20-minute drive to St. Edward's Church. On the drive, Veronica did her best to hide the stress she was already feeling about seeing Tim. She tried to think instead about her own plans for the afternoon. She and her new boyfriend, Brian, were going to visit Fall Creek Falls, a beautiful state park 2 hours southeast of Bridgewater. Veronica pictured the mountains and waterfalls, and by the time the church came into view, Veronica could feel herself relax, just a little. After parking the car, she and Jordan headed inside to their usual pew, where Veronica started glancing through the church bulletin and greeting other parishioners. After the service was over, Veronica and Jordan said their goodbyes to Father Breen. The elderly priest nodded encouragingly at Veronica. He knew that Tim and Veronica used the church parking lot as a place to exchange custody of Jordan, and he could feel Veronica tense as she stepped outside the church and spotted Tim's car in the lot. Although Tim and Veronica had initially agreed to a 50-50 custody arrangement, Jordan was actually spending substantially more time with his mother than with his father. While Veronica was more than okay with this, she did want her child support payments to Tim to be reduced, so they reflected the actual amount of time that Jordan was spending with his dad. But hopefully, their lawyers could work something out, and soon, because Veronica really, really wanted this marriage to be over. Taking a deep breath, Veronica slipped her hand into Jordan's, and the two of them walked away from the church down the sidewalk to the parking lot. A few minutes later, she and Jordan had reached Tim, and after exchanging only a few curt words with her estranged husband, Veronica gave Jordan a big hug and told him to have a great time with his dad and with his grandmother. Then Veronica turned around and headed back toward her car. As she walked, she looked up and saw Father Breen still standing in the doorway of the church. She waved and smiled at him, and he did the same back. When Veronica reached her car, she climbed inside, turned it on, and then began the 20-minute drive back home. She already missed her son, but she'd be seeing him in a few days. And in the meantime, she did get to have some alone time with Brian. Veronica and Brian were both music and TV producers, and when they'd met about 6 months earlier, the chemistry between them had been instant. And over the last several months, their feelings for each other had only deepened and grown stronger. As Veronica pulled into the Bridgewater neighborhood, she glanced at her watch. It was just after noon. She and Brian had already spoke on the phone earlier that day, and the plan was for him to meet her at her house around this time so they could head out to Falls Creek Falls. Veronica turned down the narrow dead-end street behind her house and then into her driveway. She opened her garage door, she drove inside, and was about to push the garage door remote again to close the garage door behind her when she paused. She had noticed something in her rearview mirror as soon as she pulled into the garage, and so to get a better look, she turned around in her seat and looked out her car's back window. And sure enough, there, outside, on her driveway, was something totally unusual that should not have been there. About 20 minutes later, at 12:30 p.m., the 911 dispatcher at the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department received a frantic call from a man who identified himself as Brian Robinson. He was standing inside the house belonging to his girlfriend, Veronica Boza, and Veronica was dead. No, he had not checked for a pulse. No, he had not tried to render any medical assistance. Please, he said, giving dispatch the address, just get here. By 12:50 p.m., police cars and medical personnel lined the quiet street in front of the stately pale brick colonial house with more vehicles and flashing lights parked out back in the driveway. The white pillared porch and perimeter of the house were soon cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. Inside the house, veteran homicide detectives Johnny Crumby and Andrew Injachok stood in the spacious living room looking down at the ruined and mangled body of one of Nashville's rising stars. Veronica lay on her side on the living room floor. Spread out around her on the polished wooden floorboards was a pool of blood that had already started to darken and thicken at the edges. Veronica had been shot at close range at least 4 times. Even without an autopsy report, it was clear from the abrasions on Veronica's forearms, the open door of her car, and the spilled contents of her purse in the garage that Veronica had at first tried to outrun her attacker. But when that didn't work, she had most likely turned and stood her ground, attempting to fight her attacker off. The motive for this crime did not appear to be a robbery, since investigators quickly found money and checks in plain sight in the house, along with $300 in cash inside the kitchen pantry. But a quick check of Veronica's SUV, the garage, her purse pockets and tabletops, as well as drawers, did show that at least one important thing was missing, and that was Veronica's white iPhone. Meanwhile, the crime scene technicians had also found one important piece of physical evidence. At first glance, it had appeared to police that the killer had picked up all the shell casings from the bullets they fired into Veronica's body. But after moving aside the furniture in the living room, crime scene techs had found their first critical clue. Snugged up against the baseboard behind the white sofa was a single shell casing that the killer must have left behind in their rush to leave the house. Now, looking down at the grisly scene in front of them, even the seasoned detectives were shocked at the brutality of this crime. Although the murder rate in Nashville was almost twice the national average, very few of those homicides were ever committed in affluent neighborhoods like Bridgewater. On the other hand, as these detectives knew, Tennessee was a state that ranked in the top 5 in terms of domestic violence and domestic violence-related homicides. As crime scene technicians began moving through the house, dusting for fingerprints, taking pictures, and marking and bagging evidence, Detectives Crumby and Injachok headed for the back door. The first person they wanted to talk to was Veronica's boyfriend. Not only had Brian found Veronica's body, but his reaction to that discovery had raised some red flags for the detectives. While he had immediately called 911, it was only after the 911 dispatcher had told him to that he had even checked to see if Veronica was still alive. And after telling the dispatcher, no, Veronica had no pulse, Brian had ended the call and then immediately gone into the downstairs bathroom to wash his hands before stepping outside to wait for the police. As detectives stepped outside, they noticed that already Veronica's neighbors had begun to gather in stunned groups at the front and back of Veronica's house. Police knew it would not take long for a sense of fear and anxiety to overwhelm these families who, up until now, had felt so safe in this tranquil suburban haven with its sparkling pool and well-tended nature trails. Standing in the driveway, the detectives spotted Brian, whose apparent shock had now given way to grief. But despite his obvious distress, when the detectives asked Brian to accompany them to the police station for a formal interview, he immediately agreed to the request. Before leaving, the detectives went back inside the house to give instructions for investigators to start interviewing neighbors and putting together a timeline of when the crime had been committed. Investigators also needed to track down Veronica's coworkers and friends in case they had any information that would help police understand what was going on in Veronica's life that might have been a motive for her murder. And they also wanted police to search everywhere for Veronica's phone, along with any other electronic equipment like computers or tablets. Without access to the physical phone, the detectives wanted access as soon as possible to her cell phone records, which would show who she had spoken to that morning, and the records would show when her iPhone had been used last. 15 minutes later, the detectives and Brian walked into the nearby Hermitage police station. Once inside the interrogation room, the detectives did not waste any time. Detective Crumby pressed Brian about his whereabouts that morning and what he saw and did when he arrived at Veronica's house at 12:30 that afternoon. When Brian told them about a phone conversation he'd had with Veronica at about 11:50 a.m. as she was driving back from church, detectives exchanged a meaningful glance. If Brian's phone records confirmed that statement, they had just narrowed down the window of time during which Veronica had been killed to sometime between noon and 12:30 when Brian arrived at the house. That window would be narrowed even further when Veronica's cell records showed that Veronica had made a second call after she talked to Brian. She had called a friend, and this second conversation had ended at 12:08. So if Brian himself was not the killer, then Brian must have arrived on the scene literally just minutes after the killer had left. Hoping to clear his name, Brian tried to offer up any information he thought could be useful to their investigation. He said when he had arrived at Veronica's house, he immediately noticed that her garage door was open and she never left it open. Brian also told detectives that after making that call to Veronica at 11:50 a.m., he had stopped by a convenience store to buy some snacks for him and Veronica to enjoy on their outing they had planned for that afternoon, and he had left that store at 12:15, and he thought maybe the store had a surveillance camera that would back up his story and give him an alibi. As to why he did not try to offer any medical assistance to Veronica, Brian said that when he saw all the blood and bullet wounds, he just assumed that she was dead. And after talking with the dispatcher and checking for a pulse, Brian could not stand to have Veronica's blood all over his hands, so that was why he stepped into the bathroom to wash them. Brian then told police that the person they should be interviewing was Veronica's estranged husband, Tim. Brian told detectives that the couple was in the middle of a bitter dispute over money and custody arrangements, and so Tim would have a lot more reason to kill Veronica than he, Brian, would. Before letting Brian leave the station, police requested a DNA swab, fingerprints, and access to Brian's phone records, and Brian complied right away. While detectives did not have any evidence that would allow them to detain Brian, they also did not have any evidence that completely eliminated him as a suspect. After ending their interview with Brian, the detectives again moved quickly. They wanted to talk to the next person of interest on their possible suspect list. Hopping into their car, they headed north to tell Tim Boza that his wife had just been murdered. Tim answered their knock on the front door of his mother's house in Robertson County, a 35-minute drive from the church parking lot where Tim had picked up Jordan earlier that day. After hearing the news of Veronica's death, Tim seemed most upset not by the murder, but at the prospect of having to tell his 9-year-old son that his mother was now dead. After making plans to leave Jordan at his sister's house, Tim willingly accompanied the detectives to the police station for a formal interview. By 7 p.m. that night, he was sitting in a police interrogation room, answering pointed questions about his financial problems, how much money he stood to lose in the divorce, and the statements they'd heard about the couple's volatile relationship. Tim admitted that he and Veronica were not getting along, and that he was worried that Veronica was going to try to limit the time Tim could have custody of his son. Tim also told police that he had not wanted the divorce, suggesting that Veronica's long workdays and high-powered job had put as much strain on the marriage as Tim's money troubles had. Tim also suggested that his wife had been unfaithful. Detectives were surprised that Tim was speaking so openly about marital problems that could be seen as motives for murder, but when pressed by Detective Crumby, who told Tim, quote, "Something about you doesn't seem right," Tim pushed right back. He understood that police were only doing their job. He was the soon-to-be ex-husband, and they had to investigate his possible involvement, but he insisted that he had had nothing to do with the murder. He also told police that he could account for all of his movements that day, starting with the time he left the church parking lot at 11:45 a.m. with Jordan. Tim told detectives that after he had arrived home, he had left his son with his mother, so Jordan's grandmother, at the house, and then Tim had gone out to a home supply store to get the materials he needed to make a plumbing repair, and then he also made a stop at a local grocery store to buy some soda for Jordan. Tim produced time-stamped receipts and suggested that the police see if either store had surveillance cameras that could confirm where he was that day. Like Veronica's boyfriend, Brian, Tim also agreed to give police a DNA swab. He allowed them to take photographs of him and said it was perfectly fine if police wanted to examine his phone and confirm the list of calls Tim had made that day. That night, while waiting for the autopsy report and the crime lab's report on evidence collected at the crime scene, Detectives Crumby and Injachok started poring over the cell phone records they had obtained from the phones belonging to Tim, Brian, and Veronica. And that's when they noticed that there was one number that appeared dozens of times in Tim's phone records. It belonged to Tim's business partner, Coy Cotham, who went by the name Corey Cotham. Since Tim had already told the police that he had made several calls that day to Corey, it wasn't the identity of this caller that surprised the detectives. It was the number of calls back and forth between Corey and Tim, including 13 separate calls on the day of Veronica's murder and dozens of calls and text messages over the previous days and weeks. Intrigued, detectives ran a background check on Corey, and they were stunned to find out that he had 2 prior convictions for aggravated assault. The detectives finished work late that evening, feeling good about the progress they'd made so far. But by mid-morning the next day, so a day after Veronica was killed, August 30th, that sense of optimism had disappeared. The alibis for their 2 main suspects, Tim and Brian, had both come back rock solid. Surveillance footage would confirm that Tim was not anywhere near the crime scene when Veronica was murdered. And similarly, police were able to confirm that Brian had in fact left a convenience store at 12:15 p.m., and given that he called 911 at 12:30 p.m., just 15 minutes later, to report finding Veronica, that would not have left him enough time to commit the murder. Interviews with friends and neighbors had also failed to shine any light on what might have happened, especially with Tim and Brian in the clear. One neighbor had reported seeing a light-colored van or SUV on the road behind Veronica's house, but this neighbor could not identify the make or model, and he didn't get a license number, and he didn't get a good look at the driver. The shell casing that was found inside of Veronica's house, which turned out to be a match for the bullets recovered from the crime scene. It should be noted that all the bullets that had been fired at Veronica went through her, so they were able to find the bullets on the ground. That match was still an important clue, but only if they had a way to find out where the gun was now and who had used it. Suddenly, in the face of these disappointments, those phone records that the police were collecting and the name Corey Cotham had become the detectives' best and possibly only remaining leads. Convinced that a deeper analysis of data from the cell phones, along with the records of the calls, might generate new leads, the Metropolitan Nashville Police asked for help from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau agreed and assigned one of its experts in computer and mobile device forensics to the Veronica Boza murder investigation. So, after turning over Tim's phone and all the phone records they had to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, local investigators reached out to their new person of interest, Corey Cotham, and asked him for an interview, to which he agreed. But, like both Tim and Brian, Corey also had an alibi for the day of Veronica's murder. He told police he had spent the day at the home of a girlfriend in the Nashville area and that she could confirm this. As for any involvement in Veronica's murder, Corey said he had nothing to do with it. Unlike Tim and Brian, Corey refused to let police access his cell phone, which he said was locked inside of his vehicle. He also refused to give police a DNA swab. The detectives, who now wondered if maybe Corey had also been involved in some kind of a relationship with Veronica, responded by getting a search warrant that would allow them to impound Corey's car and examine everything inside of it, including his phone. They also got a warrant for a DNA swab and photographs of Corey. Detectives now had their suspicions about Corey, but no hard evidence that connected him to Veronica's murder. So Corey, like Tim and Brian, was allowed to leave. After searching Corey's car and retrieving his phone, detectives immediately turned it over to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and then the detectives turned their own attention to investigating Corey's alibi. Using the phone number Corey had given them, they contacted Corey's girlfriend in Nashville, Jenny Addington, who agreed to meet them in the parking lot of a shopping mall near her home. And then, once again, detectives hit a dead end. According to Jenny, she had worked an overnight shift on the night of August 28th, and then when she came home the next day at 7 a.m. on August 29th, so the day Veronica was killed, Corey was sleeping in her bedroom. And at the time of the murder, sometime between 12:08 and 12:40 p.m., Jenny was making lunch for Corey, who spent the day with her inside of her apartment. On September 5th, 6 days after Veronica's murder, Nashville's music community turned out in force to attend Veronica's funeral service. Also in attendance were Tim and Jordan, as well as Veronica's boyfriend, Brian, and police. But the only intel officers picked up was a rising murmur of concern and fear. What had really happened to Veronica? And could her murderer be right here in this church right now? It wouldn't be until 6 days after that funeral service that investigators would get a phone call that would finally give them the answers to those questions and would break the homicide case wide open. On Saturday, September 11th, exactly 2 weeks after Veronica's murder, Corey's Nashville girlfriend, Jenny, called the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department and asked to speak with Detectives Crumby and Injachok. She told the officer who had picked up her call that she had not been entirely truthful with the detectives when she had spoken to them last, and now she was terrified and she wanted to come into the police station and tell the detectives what she actually knew. Based on the new statement Jenny would make to detectives on September 11th, along with an analysis of cell phone data that would map out the actual physical location of Veronica's iPhone both before and after her murder, this is a reconstruction of what actually happened to her on the day she was killed. Sunday, August 29th was hot and humid, but inside of St. Edward's Catholic Church in Nashville, the air was cool, and as the 10:30 a.m. Mass came to an end, Veronica felt a sense of peace settle over her. She sat quietly for a moment with her son Jordan, exchanging goodbyes with other parishioners and waiting for the pews to clear before she and her son also slipped out into the center aisle and began making their way to the big doors at the back of the church. As Veronica and Jordan passed by Father Breen on their way outside, Veronica stopped for a second to shake hands with the priest. She had been so grateful over the past year for his support and encouragement. Now, as she glanced toward the parking lot where she knew Tim would be waiting, Father Breen smiled and gave her hand an encouraging squeeze. Veronica smiled back and thanked him again for his prayers and blessings before stepping from the dim interior of the church into the sun and heat. Outside, Veronica's killer watched from a distance as Veronica and her son walked hand in hand across the church parking lot to where Veronica's estranged husband, Tim, waited for them, his arms crossed, leaning against the side of his car. The killer had already spent hours following Veronica on other occasions, still waiting for the right opportunity. But this morning's setup looked promising. The child would be out of the picture, and as Veronica turned away from Jordan and Tim to walk over to her own car, she looked relaxed and didn't even seem to notice her surroundings or her killer. And that was unusual because Veronica's killer was such a big guy, he was 6'5" tall and nearly 300 pounds, that people did tend to notice him wherever he went, and usually he welcomed the attention, just not now. The killer smiled, satisfied with how things were going so far, and watched as Veronica pulled her phone out of her purse and started tapping her screen as she walked the final distance across the lot to her car. A few moments later, Veronica disappeared into her SUV and started up the engine. As she maneuvered her car out of the parking lot and out onto the expressway that was the fastest route from the church to her home, where she and her boyfriend Brian would soon meet, Veronica did not notice the light-colored large SUV that had slid into the lane several cars behind her. The killer knew where Veronica was headed next, and so he quickly passed her vehicle and rushed all the way to the turnoff into her neighborhood, the Bridgewater development, before Veronica got there. By now, the killer had spent enough time spying on Veronica that he knew she liked to park inside of her garage, and then she would enter her house through the door in the garage that connected to the kitchen of the house. The killer also knew that Veronica always immediately closed the garage door behind her after she pulled her car inside. So he pulled into a nearby alley and waited, knowing that he would have to move very quickly once she arrived and pulled her car down the driveway into the garage so that he did not get blocked out by the closing garage door. And sure enough, as soon as Veronica arrived at the development and pulled into her driveway, her killer was on the move. As the garage door slowly opened, he pulled his van right into the driveway behind her. He caught a quick glimpse of Veronica's face in her rearview mirror, and he saw her eyes widen in sudden alarm. Then he was out of his car, gloves on, hat pulled down low, and a tactical sleeve covering most of his face. As the man calmly walked with great long strides into her garage, Veronica scrambled out of her car, dropping her purse and all of its contents onto the floor. Then she stood up and ran to the door that connected the garage to her house, and she opened it up. But before she could get through that door and lock it behind her, her attacker had lunged and caught her by the wrist. Adrenaline now flooding through Veronica's body, she twisted violently out of his grasp and then flung herself forward, falling first into the kitchen, and then after getting back onto her feet, she lunged even farther into the house, into the living room. As she did this, she and her attacker, who was still right behind her, smashed into tables and chairs and paintings and knocked things off counters and tabletops in the wall, until finally, in the living room, Veronica's killer grabbed hold of her arm again, and he spun Veronica around to face him while he simultaneously raised his pistol and began firing. At least 4 shots were fired from the killer's high-point semi-automatic weapon. One of the bullets hit Veronica's right shoulder and arm, breaking bones before exiting her body. A second bullet entered above and behind her left ear and then exited on the other side of her head between her right ear and forehead. Another bullet that had entered her left ear ricocheted inside of her skull and then exited just above her right eye. The killer, seeing Veronica now bleeding out on the polished wood floor of her living room, knew without a doubt that the 2 shots he had fired into her head were lethal. Pausing only to catch his breath, Veronica's killer quickly scooped up the spent shell casings from the floor before taking off back to the garage and grabbing Veronica's white iPhone off the garage floor before jumping into his large SUV. Later that day, the killer would call a friend and ask for instructions on how to unlock an iPhone and also how to remove the battery from an iPhone. But for now, as he was making his escape, the killer simply powered off Veronica's iPhone, put it in his pocket, and then drove as casually as he could out of the Bridgewater development and headed back to the expressway and began driving towards Nashville. Earlier that same morning, Jenny arrived home from her overnight shift, not at 7 a.m. as she had first told detectives, but at about 9:30 a.m. Her boyfriend, Corey, was not there at the time. Tired, Jenny immediately showered and then went right to bed. Because she lived with roommates that she did not entirely trust, Jenny actually kept her handbag with her in the bed as she slept. It contained her wallet and her car keys. At some point that morning, shortly after Jenny had climbed into bed, Jenny woke up to find Corey bending over her. When he kissed her and told her he was going out for a little while, she wondered sleepily if he was also slipping his hand under her covers to grab the keys to her minivan. But since her only concern at the moment was just to go back to sleep, Jenny turned over again and closed her eyes. She didn't wake up again until mid-afternoon. That was when Corey woke her and told her he wanted to take her out to an early dinner at a restaurant near Nashville called TGI Fridays. They got into Corey's car, a champagne-colored Cadillac Escalade with a vanity license plate that read Big Man, and headed off for their evening out. At some point along the way, a thin white phone slipped off the console of Corey's Escalade and landed on the floor. Jenny leaned down, picked up the iPhone, and put it back on the console next to the black Android phone that she recognized as Corey's. She didn't ask him where the white phone had come from. Jenny knew that Corey had all kinds of business dealings with all kinds of people, and she suspected that some of that business and some of those people were pretty shady. It had been Corey, after all, who had convinced Jenny to steal her soon-to-be ex-husband's high-point 9mm handgun, along with plenty of ammunition, back in July. At the time, Corey said that Jenny might need it for protection, and she had been carrying it around ever since in the back of her minivan in a red-maroon lunch bag. Except that Jenny's ex had filed a stolen weapon report with police, and when Jenny had gone to look for the gun a few weeks ago, thinking she should just return it in case police decided to come question her about the missing weapon, the gun and the maroon bag had disappeared from her car. She'd asked Corey at the time if he'd taken it, since he sometimes borrowed her van and also helped her now and then take groceries out of the rear compartment, but he denied ever touching it. By the afternoon of the following day, Monday, August 30th, Corey was in a terrible mood. He told Jenny that police were after him for information about the recent murder of his business partner's wife and that they had impounded both his Cadillac Escalade and his cell phone. Corey told her that she really needed to help him out. Just to get the cops off of his back, he told them that he had been with her all day yesterday, and if police got in touch with her, that's what she should tell them. That he'd been at the apartment with her from 7 a.m. till they left the apartment together to go eat dinner at TGI Fridays. Jenny agreed because she knew this wasn't really a request, it was an order, and she knew better than to cross Corey when he was in one of his moods. But it wasn't until after police did talk to Jenny that evening outside of the strip mall, and she confirmed Corey's alibi, that Jenny started to feel uneasy and a little afraid about having done what Corey had told her to do. As details of Veronica's murder started being reported all over the news, Jenny thought again about that missing gun that she had taken from her ex and about that white iPhone she had seen in Corey's Escalade. And then things got even worse. It turned out that one of Corey's acquaintances had told police that Corey had asked him to clean a high-point pistol for Corey and that Corey had brought the weapon to him inside of a maroon lunch bag. And shortly after that development, Jenny had overheard Corey making plans to leave the United States for Barbados, an island country in the West Indies. Worried that she was about to get caught in the middle of a legal mess, and increasingly afraid that Corey was the person who had taken that gun out of her minivan, Jenny decided she had to come clean to police about Corey's alibi. So on September 11th, Jenny called the Metropolitan Nashville Police and told Detectives Injichok and Crumby the truth about Corey's alibi. That on the morning of Sunday, August 29th, Jenny had no idea where Corey was between 7 a.m. and mid-afternoon when he woke her up to bring her to TGI Fridays. After this admission, Jenny agreed to fully cooperate with police. She also agreed to a DNA swab and allowed police to examine her phone. And police quickly ruled Jenny herself out as a suspect, since her phone was nowhere near the crime scene when Veronica was murdered. But what Jenny didn't know when she called the detectives to tell the truth was that the police had actually already come to the conclusion that Corey had to be the killer. According to the phone forensics expert from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, on the day of Veronica's murder, even though her phone had been powered off, they were able to track its position. And on that day, after her death, Veronica's white iPhone followed the exact same track as another phone. And that phone was Corey's black Android. It would turn out Jenny's suspicions were correct. Corey had indeed taken the gun from the back of her minivan, and he had used that gun to kill Veronica Boza. He would be arrested on September 21st, 23 days after the murder. But that was not the end of this murder investigation, because police were about to uncover one final unbelievable twist to the Veronica Boza homicide, which was literally the kind of thing you would expect to see in a movie. It would turn out Corey was not Veronica's only killer. Although this other killer was far away from the Bridgewater development at the time of the crime, and he never so much as touched the weapon that was used to kill his wife, it was Tim Boza, Veronica's estranged husband, who had first planted the idea that led to Veronica's death. Back in late June, early July, bitter and broke over a divorce that looked like it would end with him getting less time than he wanted with his son and less money than he wanted from Victoria, Tim and his business partner and best friend, Corey Cotham, who was also broke and also facing relationship issues, started talking about a crisscross murder scheme, just like the one that Hollywood actors Danny DeVito and Billy Crystal played out in the 1987 comedy thriller Throw Mama from the Train, where Billy Crystal's character agrees to murder the mother of Danny DeVito's character, and Danny DeVito's character agrees to murder the wife of Billy Crystal's character. But unlike in the movie, where neither the overbearing mother or the deceitful wife is actually killed, Corey and Tim decided they should do this and actually follow through. The plan was that Corey would kill Veronica for Tim, which he did, and in exchange, Tim would kill the ex-husband of one of Corey's girlfriends for Corey. However, Tim did not get a chance to commit that murder before they were caught. And although Tim later denied that the two men had any kind of formal agreement to carry out either murder, investigators would go on to find plenty of evidence to the contrary, at least when it came to the murder of Tim's wife, Veronica. That evidence included the 13 phone calls that Tim and Corey exchanged on the day Veronica was killed, along with several text messages in which the men planned the murder. And just after the murder, Tim got an update from Corey saying, quote, "It's done." It would turn out that in addition to just wanting their respective kill targets erased because of the trouble they were apparently causing them, both men, Corey and Tim, had a big financial motive to carry out the murders. Specifically, the murder of Veronica. Corey expected to be paid $35,000 for killing Veronica, and Tim, who knew if Veronica was killed before their divorce finalized, would be the beneficiary of his wife's $550,000 life insurance policy. The Boza's financial planner later testified that on the day of Veronica's funeral, Tim had approached him immediately after, asking when Tim could expect that life insurance payout. In February of 2012, Corey Cotham was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and, quote, especially aggravated robbery, and was sentenced to life without parole plus 25 years. 6 months later, in October, Tim, who had testified against Corey at Corey's earlier trial, was sentenced to life in prison as well, but with the possibility of parole after 51 years. As of 2021, Veronica and Tim's son, Jordan, was living with an aunt in Tennessee and was going to college. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are two people in the front two seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these two guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these two creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually two people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was "DC Snipers Caught." It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Mohammed was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence. In 1988, 35-year-old Ivan McGuire was an experienced skydiving instructor with over 700 jumps to his name. On April 5th of that year, he was working in North Carolina, and he was tasked with filming other instructors and their students after they jumped out of the plane. The way this worked is Ivan would go up in the plane with the instructor and their student, and Ivan would be the first to leap out of the plane. He would roll onto his back, and he would film upward towards the plane, and he would capture the student and instructor jumping out, and Ivan would continue to film them until they pulled pulled their chutes, at which point he would pull his. Now, being 1988, the filming equipment that Ivan was using was much larger and more cumbersome than something you would use today. He had a voice-activated camera attached to his helmet, and then from there was a cord going to this big heavy VHS deck that he kept in a backpack. But despite the nuisance of the equipment, Ivan went up with the first student and instructor and successfully filmed their jump. When he got back on the ground, Ivan went over to the riggers and he gave them his parachutes so they could pack it for him, and then Ivan went over to a bench and began fiddling with his camera equipment. It was clear he was frustrated with the way it was set up and he was making all sorts of adjustments. When it was time for Ivan's second jump of the day with a new instructor and new student, he was so preoccupied with fiddling with his camera that he forgot to grab his parachute. And so he ran over to the plane and he's about to get on, and they say, "Hey, Ivan, you're not wearing a parachute." And he goes, "Oh my goodness, you're right." He runs back over, he gets his parachute, he loads back in the plane, he goes up to altitude, and then he jumps out, he films the instructor and student, it all goes great, he makes it to the ground, and his second jump is a success. And just like after the first jump of the day, Ivan takes off his parachute, he gives it to the riggers, and then he goes and sits down on a bench and continues to fidget and fiddle around with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's third jump of the day with yet another new instructor and student, this time he grabbed his parachute, put all of his gear on, ran over to the plane, hopped on board, and he took off. Once they got up to their jumping altitude, which was 10,500 feet, Ivan turned on his camera, and the footage shows the instructor and the student kind of getting their gear together, sitting across from him in the plane. The jump master towards the front of the plane slides open the side door. Ivan, who's going to be the first one out, makes his way to the edge. He turns himself upside down, so he's sitting basically with his back outside of the plane. He makes sure the instructor and student are right on top of him, ready to jump out right afterwards. Once they're ready, Ivan falls out backwards and continues to film. You see the instructor and student jump out right afterwards. Ivan continues to film them as they go down. They're in free fall for a few seconds, and then you see the instructor and student pull their parachutes, at which time Ivan reaches back to pull his own, but he can't find it. For a few seconds he flails, and you can see his hands coming out in front of the camera, and he's trying to reach for his ripcord, and then he realizes what's happened. That parachute he grabbed before he loaded up in the plane was not a parachute. He grabbed his heavy backpack that had that big VHS deck in it, and when he put it on, he mistook it for the parachute. And so now, falling at terminal velocity with no way to stop himself, he begins yelling out, "Oh no, oh God, no!" And he keeps reaching back as if he's just gonna find this cord, but there's nothing there. And after a few agonizing seconds, you see the ground getting closer and closer and closer, and then it cuts out. Ivan's body was later found about 1.5 miles outside of the drop zone in the woods. His camera and videotape were severely damaged, but they were able to splice it together, and that's why we know what happened in his final moments. An investigation into his death showed the pilot made the same mistake Ivan did. When he saw Ivan with that backpack on, he assumed it was a parachute, and so ultimately Ivan's death was ruled an accident. Fair warning, if you look into this case, you will almost certainly come across the actual footage of Ivan's final jump. In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man, and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here? And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door. And he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second, because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, were you adopted? And Bobby said, yeah. And then the student said, is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, yeah. And so the student goes, okay, my name is Michael and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you, because they love Eddie, and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie, and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, hey Eddie, my name's Bobby and everybody thinks I'm you. And then Eddie says, yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too. And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin. After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, they're coming out of the woodwork. So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same cigarettes. We liked the same food. We had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms. And on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York. Very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone. Then he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. business, and it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the three brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks, and then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowitz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become? Or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope, he's trying to brush them off. He finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up and he begins making his way back up. And the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, he redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell." In 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. This was not a typical farm with animals and crops. It was a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and Evan and his family made their living baling pine straw every year. As such, their main living house on the farm was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined up pine trees. They did not have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one road that led into the property, which from the main house, they could look out and basically see through the rows of trees all the way to the beginning of this road, which meant any visitors were really easy to spot. The main house was built on a very slight hill, which meant one side of the house was effectively built on stilts to compensate for the angle. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. So anyone who was in the living room looking out the window, they basically need to look at a downward angle to see the ground. It would actually seem like you were on the second floor, but really you're on the first floor. The window in the living room was very unique. It stretched almost the entire length of the room, so almost 50 feet across. And at night, you could see animals darting between the different trees because you could see down the rows. And so that was pretty creepy. And then just the fact that this window is so big, if you're in the living room at night, you just felt really exposed. So between the creepy animals running around and the level of exposure and vulnerability, people basically avoided the living room anytime they were in the house at night. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with him on his farm, and because the main house did not have any extra bedrooms, Evan and his cousin would have to sleep in the living room. There were two couches inside of the living room, one that was right underneath the 50-foot long window, and then another which was on the other side of the room against a wall that did not have a window. And so Evan would be sleeping on the couch right under the window, and his cousin would be sleeping on the other couch. The first night Evan's cousin was there, they put this big sheet up over the window, but it only blocked like 75% of the window. The two flanks of the window were still exposed, but where the couches were lined up, they were kind of blocked by this sheet, so it gave them a little bit of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the boys finally fell asleep around midnight, and then they woke up a couple hours later because they heard Evan's dogs barking way off in the pine trees. Now, Evan was used to his dogs running around the property and barking at other smaller animals, and so just them barking was not necessarily a red flag. But the barking persisted to the point where Evan's cousin got up off the couch, moved across the room to the opening of the window that was not covered by the sheet at the foot of where Evan was sleeping. Now, Evan was still laying on the couch. He was not going to get up and look out the window, so he's looking down at his cousin, kind of looking at his face to get some sort of a read on what he's seeing. And he notices his cousin has this really perplexed look on his face, like he's squinting his eyes and trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And so Evan looks at him and says, "Hey, what's going on? What do you see?" And his cousin's like, "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At this, Evan jumps off the couch and runs over and butts up right next to his cousin so he can look out the window too. And he's scanning out amongst the rows of trees because there's just a mile of pine trees. And the first thing he notices is the moon is very bright that night. So there's good illumination, and there was a light snow covering on the ground, which really added to the illumination. He's looking out maybe 100 meters when he sees someone's leg extend from behind one of the pine trees as if they're stepping into the space between a pine tree column. And he's staring at it, and he can't believe he's even seeing anyone walking around this area because he didn't see anybody come in on the road and they have no neighbors. And so he's looking, and then a body follows the leg. A person walks from one row to the next. This tall, dark figure just walks calm as can be between the two pine trees. And Evan just grabs his cousin and he's like, "Did you just see that?" And his cousin's like, "Yeah, I saw that." And so they continue to look in the direction of where this person crossed the path. And after a couple of minutes, they see another leg now emerging, going the other way, back towards where that first person had come from. So the leg kind of extends into this gap, and then this tall figure walks across into the next row, except now, instead of going just directly across, it looks like they're moving at an angle closer to the main house property. The boys look at each other and they don't know what to do, so they just keep looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they're looking, they see this person emerge again, except now they're not 100 meters away, they're like 20 meters away. They don't know how they were able to move that quickly without being seen. And this time when the leg comes out from behind the pine tree, instead of walking across the gap, it stops right in the middle, and it turns and it looks directly at the boys in the window and then begins running toward them. The boys practically fall over trying to get away from the window. Evan's yelling for his father upstairs, and the boys instinctively just start running around the house, locking every door, shutting every window. And as they're going from door to door, the anxiety is growing and growing because they think, if I don't get there fast enough, this person who is running towards the property is going to come barging through that door. And so at every door, their anxiety is through the roof, but they manage to shut everything. Everything is locked right as Evan's father comes charging down the stairs. He's got his gun in hand and he's like, what's going on? And they say, there's someone out in our property. Their dad charges out the front door. The front door is not on the same wall as the living room. It's on the side of the house. So once he goes outside, he's going to need to turn to the right to look out in the direction they were describing. He bombs outside, he stays on the porch, and he starts yelling at whoever's out there that if you come over here, I'm going to shoot you, get the F away from here. And then there's silence. And the boys are waiting, they're looking around, they're checking the window. They don't see anything. The dad comes back inside, he shut and locks the door, and he tells Evan, keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know. Evan would reflect on this experience later on and say, you know, we really should have called 911 at that point. But as a kid, I just understood that that's the way my family did business. We kind of took care of ourselves. And so even though there is a threat of some stranger who's running at our property, we were not going to call the cops. And so his dad effectively was telling him to be a lookout. And so Evan and his cousin, they go back into the living room and they kind of go up to the window. They're a little bit apprehensive and they're looking out. And after 5-10 minutes of looking out the window and not seeing anything, they're thinking to themselves, you know, Evan's dad's a pretty intimidating guy and he was just out there screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. So they probably got the message and they're probably gone. And so the boys got back into their couches, and it took them a while, but they did ultimately fall asleep. The next morning when the boys got up, the first thing they wanted to do was go out there and see if they could find footprints from this person to kind of confirm it really was a person, because part of them thought, you know, maybe we didn't see that. Maybe that was our imaginations. They don't know. And so they start by going out the front door, so not on the same wall as the living room. They go out the front door, they turn and they walk down into the trees, and they're looking around and they find some footprints. So they're confirming to themselves, okay, there was someone out here. It wasn't us. This is not our footprints. We found them. So they start following the footprints back towards the property, and they realize at some point there are two distinct sets of footprints. There were two people out here. And even worse is they followed them all the way up to the house. And there were two different circles of footprints that stopped right underneath the living room window along the two flanks of the window where the sheet was not covering. Which means over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were up at that window looking out, there's a good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up against the side of the house. And they would not have seen them because of the angle out of the living room window. It was steep because of the stilts it was on. And so anybody that was tucked up along the side, they'd be in a blind spot. And then for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into bed and were sleeping, there were two strangers who were right up against those windows, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father found these footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from, but unfortunately the snow cover wasn't complete, and at some point they lost the tracks and they never figured out who those two people were. Evan would say, following this event, his cousin refused to ever come back over his house for a sleepover. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated, there's lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, you know, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside, and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. And he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." And he said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss. She goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was gonna die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't, and so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially, he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of the sleep paralysis, when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. And she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark. And he's left paralyzed, knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor. And she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step, two-step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance, stop this paralysis, wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before, now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled, she's half asleep, and she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down, and they're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear, and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me, and it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what
stretches through the treetops, painting gold along the breeze. I can hear the quiet footsteps of a message meant for me. Feather light, the echo lingers, calling softly through the air, like a whisper from the heavens only dreamers learn to bear. Every moment feels anew.
what it is and where you found it. Give us the timestamp. And if you're the first person to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please eat all of the like button's Oreos except for one, and then put the box back in the pantry, and then also crumple all of their potato chips. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter, where my username is the same. It's JohnBallen.